Welcome. We've got 3 more crazy cryptid stories featuring these titles starting at those times. And we've got this creepy and allegedly true tale that we're told is called Swamp Monsters. A real. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I saw a swamp monster once in the summer of 1976 in the Honey Island Swamp area. If you aren't familiar, it's a long swath of green resting right on the border of Louisiana and Mississippi. A lot of it is located inside the Pearl River Wildlife Management Area, and it's surrounded in nearly all directions by other wildlife areas. If there were ever a perfect habitat for a creepy old swamp bugger, the Honey Island Swamp is it. It all happened a few days or a week after July 4th of that year, which was the bicentennial. That was back when they used to encourage us to love America, which my grandchildren now tell me is a bad place to live. Anyway, that's how I remember what year this took place in. It was the bicentennial. I was driving west in the middle of the night across Interstate 10 in Slidell, Louisiana, and when I got to that part where the road becomes a bridge over the old Pearl River, my old crate sputtered a bit, then gave up and died in about the worst place possible. There's no side lane on that bridge that you can pull off into. There's just the 2 lanes to drive on, and you aren't supposed to stop there for any reason whatsoever. Now, I told my old jalopy all of that, but it was unimpressed, since apparently it was already a goner. I suppose by then it was technically a former car, but I was still in denial about it. I wanted to put the blinkers on to warn people that I was there, but nothing in the car was working other than the horn. I was panicked that I was going to get rammed from behind in the dark night, and that we were all going to fall 100 miles down into the brown muddy river far below. There wasn't too much traffic that night, but each vehicle felt like it was going to smash into me and end my life story with a bang. When a big semi went by, I could feel the bridge shake so hard that my feet were levitating off the ground. The little rails and walls on the side felt way too low to the ground for my taste on that night. I had served a tour of duty overseas, and I saw some action over there, yet I strangely felt more scared on that bridge than I had felt running from enemy fire. It seemed confusing in real time that I was acting like such a kid. I had to get myself out of that situation, but instead, I was just frozen with fear. I stood alongside the defunct car, looking out into the river far, far below, and then I saw something truly odd. A dark, hairy figure was walking out of the vegetation on the side of the river down there, and he or it was wading out into the river itself. I was not really noticing the size or height of the creature before it walked into the water, but as it drew almost directly in front of me down there, I noticed it was still keeping its head above the water. I wondered how deep that river was, and how tall that dark figure was. It seemed almost like an optical illusion that the creature wasn't entirely submerged, but maybe there's a simple prosaic explanation for it. Like maybe the river in that part is shallower than it seems, I don't know. Admittedly, the water is somewhat opaque, so this might have been the case for all I know. It sure seemed alarmingly strange to me in that moment, though. This figure, in that context, appeared so dark to me that I could not make out any features on it whatsoever. I was wondering where its eyes were, when I saw 2 red glowing orbs sort of rise up onto the entity's face. I gasped when this happened, not understanding what I was seeing. In retrospect, I think the inky black creature was facing downward, and then merely lifted his head to look at me. This was why I didn't see the eyes until that moment, and why they seemed to rise up onto his face somehow. It was just the brightness of the eyes contrasting against the sheer deep darkness of the creature's fur and body. I was not expecting the animal man to scream at me, and it surprised me so much that I almost stepped backward into traffic. It was shouting at me in a sort of an abusive manner. I mean, it seemed to be scolding me, criticizing me, like wagging its finger at me. But even stranger than any of that was how loud his screaming was. Again, this felt like an illusion of some sort, but an audio illusion this time. The Beastman was too far away for me to have been hearing what I was hearing. It seemed as though his body was far down below, but his vocal cords were 6 inches in front of me. I literally held my fingers in my ears to block out the sound. It was that painful. That terrible and impossible swamp booger stopped shouting for a second, but my ears kept ringing like a high-pitched hearing test for quite a long time afterward. The sound seemed to be coming and going in waves, but I knew it wasn't anything happening out in the real world. It was my ears suffering from the damage of that extremely long and prolonged noise that the swamp booger had subjected me to. Still, the rise and fall and rise of the painful ear ringing was quite hypnotizing. I couldn't do anything to make the sound stop, and it took a good few minutes before I lowered its volume enough to let me even make out the world around me again. I couldn't understand why that manimal thing had done that to me, and I also didn't understand why he stopped either. I looked at him, wondering what he was, why he seemed so fixated on me when he couldn't know anything about me. And as I looked at him, his eyes seemed to vibrate along with the ear ringing, and I could almost see concentric rings of energy rising up from him toward me, transfixing me in a deep stare into his glowing red orbs. I felt like I was moving with the waves around the creature, and that everything sort of swirled around his intense, glowing eyes. I began to feel as though the world were fading out and reducing itself in volume until a police siren bleeped at me, shocking me out of my daze and almost sending me over the edge of the railing into the creature's water far below. As the cops set up flares to alert oncoming traffic of the situation, I looked down into the river for the swamp monster. I wanted to show the 2 cops what I had witnessed, but I couldn't see the creature anywhere below. The officers ordered me to get behind the wheel and release the brake so that they could push the car off the bridge and out of danger. When I got there behind the wheel, though, I got the absolutely strangest sensation, almost like ESP or something. I felt the urge to turn the key in the ignition, and to the surprise of all 3 of us, the engine started up more easily than it ever had before, at least in the time I had owned that beat-up old wreck. Feeling pretty sheepish, I pulled the car up off the bridge and then to the side of the road at the first available opportunity. One of the officers came over to my window and lectured me somewhat savagely. He seemed to want to pummel me, but he was too much of a professional. I couldn't say anything, except to tell him that he was right, and that I was sorry, and so forth. I was going to try to explain that I didn't know how the engine had healed itself, but the 2 men told me I was getting off with a warning, and then they stormed back to their police vehicle. I was free to go. Nervously, I tried to start the engine again, but like last time, it revved to life and purred like a happy kitten. This baffled me for years until I was watching that Steven Spielberg space alien movie from a year or 2 or 3 after this happened. In that movie, Close Encounters I mean, people's cars turn off when the aliens are near, and they turn back on after the aliens split. That was what happened with me and the swamp booger that yelled at me. Was it a coincidence? Or did the presence of that creature somehow cause my car to shut down? And if there was a connection, was it something that the creepy cryptid was somehow able to do deliberately? I was thinking maybe he just had a magnetic presence that caused engines to conk out, but a number of vehicles whizzed past while I was stuck there, and they didn't seem to even be slowed down a little bit. So if the swamp booger did that to me, he was somehow able to do it only to me, and to not bother anyone else in the process. This is the only monster experience I've ever had, so I'm hardly any kind of expert on the subject. I am glad it happened to me, now that I'm much, much older. Why? Because, if nothing else, now I can look my grandkids in the eye, and I can tell them from the bottom of my heart, hey kids, you know what? Swamp monsters are real. Dogman versus Catman. They did not appreciate being interrupted. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I remember seeing a canine-headed cryptid and a feline-headed cryptid having some kind of altercation. The memory is from my childhood, and I've never been completely certain that it actually really happened. I mean, I was probably 5 years old or 6, so it might have been a dream, or a daydream. I remember the accompanying emotions from the event though, so it feels like a real memory to me. I was delighted to see these animals at first, but when I realized they were having a violent battle, and that they resented me interrupting them, well, let's just say, I wasn't delighted anymore. My family still lives in the house I grew up in, so I don't really want to get into locations, but we are a bit to the east and south of the Midwest. Sorry to be vague, but that's the way it's got to be. Our land extends a bit behind the house and becomes more wooded the further you walk away. Other properties in the area are also set up to end in the same central woodland that all the houses are built around. So it was, I believe, my 5th or 6th birthday, and the family was having a party in the back with a bunch of kids that apparently I didn't really know. That was what my mother told me about it later. She said that I was cranky because I didn't want to play with those kids. I wanted to stay inside and watch TV. She said I cried a lot and was making everyone miserable, adults included. When I wandered off by myself toward the woods, I had my cryptid sighting. My mom told me she was at first relieved to not be hearing me whining and weeping anymore. She hoped I had calmed down, and she was finally able to give some attention to her guests. Free of my social obligations, the young version of me set out to live off the grid. And so I enjoyed looking way up at those tall trees, wondering what they look like from the top, and how far you could see if you climbed them. I still love to stare up at trees and clouds, and it started as a thing I did in those early days. And as I was lost in my own world, I wandered into a small clearing with my head pointed straight upward, not watching where I was going. Suddenly I heard hissing erupting from in front of me, and I screamed. Off in the distance, I'm not really sure how far away, but not very far, there was the source of the hissing. It was not a snake, or a sleestack, or a lizard person. It was a cat, but the biggest and strangest cat I'd ever seen. It seemed funny to me, and it seemed awesome. There was another huge figure beyond the feline one. That one seemed like a cross between a bear and a dog somehow. That one was growling at me. Both had furry bodies, like a cat or a dog, but the upright bipedal skeletons under those fur coats were almost more human than anything else. I think the one might have been a dogman, but the other one I can't really say. It seemed like a cat, but it also seemed like a monster. The mouth looked uncertain if it wanted to be a cat mouth or a human one. It sort of looked like a gray cat, with a human or ape mouth protruding through the feline mouth. I don't know if I'm describing it clearly, and I can't think of any real animals, or even fictional ones, that ever had a mouth like this one. The teeth protruded forward, and were not like a cat's teeth, although I can't really say what they did resemble. This was the creature that hissed at me, which of course is another trait that made it resemble a cat. The other one, the bigger one, I remember being a big brown dog. It stood more like a gorilla than a dog, though. It was usually bipedal, but sometimes it used one of its long front arms to prop itself up on, and then sometimes it stood quadrupedally. I remember it baring its teeth to growl, and at first I thought it was growling at the feline person. Maybe it was. There sure was a lot of cat and dog fur all over the ground, so they must have been having a violent tussle before I showed up. Noticing finally that both beings were exhibiting some severe hostility toward me, that was when I stopped giggling, and I began screaming bloody murder instead. In my mental version of things, my mother was there the very instant I shouted for her. I have no idea how long she actually took to find me, just as I have no memory of whether my screeching had scared the two cryptids off, or whether the arrival of my mother had, but in any case, they were no longer there, as my mother calmed me down and walked me back to the party. We discussed this many times before her passing, and she always insisted to me that she never saw either the Dogman or the Catman. This is one of the reasons I don't know if I really saw any of it either. I might be conflating getting lost in the woods on my birthday with a bad dream about monsters. So long after the fact, it's hard to say. I suffered from nightmares about this event through my childhood into my teenage years. Usually the dreams were about regret, though, more than the actual things that happened on that day. I would arrive on the scene in the backyard for my 5th or 6th birthday party, and I would hate the other kids. I would walk off into the trees, knowing that I shouldn't be doing that. I knew what was out there. I knew that my presence was going to upset the two large beasts. I look up at the trees and the sky, as I remember doing on that day, but there's no pleasure to derive from it. Everything seems frightening. Everything warns me to go back, but I keep moving forward. And after they see me, and they get angry at me, I wake up, and I think to myself, Dogman versus Catman. They didn't appreciate being interrupted. I saw a Dogman Pack. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I watch the house and pets of a guy who works in local television here in the Midwest. I don't want to give away too many details, but it's a house in a very posh suburban town that lots of rich lawyers and politicians live in. There are big, beautiful, old 2- and 3-story houses. I'm not sure I'd call most of them mansions, but everyone there is well-heeled. The first time I watched that house, I learned a lesson about not walking around the neighborhood after sundown, when I saw a real-life, honest-to-Christmas, Dogman Pack running around, chasing small animals around the edge of town. On the day when the family was set to go on vacation, and I was set to move in with the dogs and cats and fish and gerbils, the patriarch of the family showed me how I could take a shortcut to walk to the one food market in the area. It was out by the highway and open all night, I was happy to hear. It was about a 25-minute walk each way down some back streets and across a fenced-off field that had been allowed to get overgrown with trees like a mini forest in there. It was a beautiful walk there and back, and I was looking forward to my stay. So, in a night or two, I got a craving for some kind of junk food. I forget what kind. I set out in the dark toward the store at, I guess, around 10 p.m. Man, it was so dark out. I hadn't noticed during the day that there were no streetlights out there. The only illumination was coming from the houses, where people all seemed to be watching TV. I didn't really think too much of it, though, because I figured there'd be no crime in that neighborhood. On the way back from the store, I entered that overgrown pathway between properties, the fenced-off area I was telling you about earlier. At night, it was so dark in there that you had to watch where you were going and take it step by step so that you didn't walk into a tree. I could sense things moving around me in the darkness, faster and faster, circling me. These were things that came up to around my waist. I was panicking and frightened, but trying to remain calm. As I got to the other end of my dark passage, I could now see that these were canines, light-colored dogs. Maybe they were large coyotes. They didn't really look like wolves, but they did look feral, and they all seemed to be the same color as each other. The dogs continued to dance around me in circles gleefully. I wasn't sure if they were acting like pet dogs greeting their master coming home from work, or wild dogs playing with their dinner. I just kept walking as straight and steady as I could manage, slowing a bit when one of them would dash in front of me, but mostly trying to maintain my speed and pace. I wanted to appear as nonchalant as I could, so that I didn't cue these canines in on the fact that I was afraid of them. Suddenly, one of the dogs let out a soft yip, and it reared back up on its hind legs. Doing this made it taller than me, and caused me to stop still in surprise and fear. The dog seemed to be seeing something off in the distance that was of great interest. Almost instantly, all the other dogs stood up in the same way, all staring in the same direction, like giant meerkats. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, and I couldn't move a muscle. Neither did the beasts seem to even be breathing. We had all completely frozen in place. In that moment, I noticed how broad the chests and shoulders of the beasts appeared to be when they stood bipedally. If I had seen them standing before I saw them running around, I might have thought I was seeing very tall human beings. One of the dogs let out a loud series of yips that almost made me keel over in shock. Then they all took off running between two of the houses. Most of them remained on their hind legs as they ran, with only the two smallest ones dropping to all fours to keep pace with the pack. I watched them until they were out of sight, and then I turned and ran back to my client's house faster than I'd ever run before. I'm still very happy to house sit for this local TV guy and his family. I love to take care of their cats and dogs, who are very nice people in their own right. But once the sun goes down, I lock myself inside. Even if I've forgotten to put out the garbage cans that night, it's gonna have to wait till the sun comes up. Ever since that night that I saw a Dogman Pack. Today's executive producer is named Chris C. That's the way it's supposed to be. I'm only trying to tell you that's the way that it is. Today's EP has the name of Chris. Please join me in thanking today's executive producer, the grand and glorious Chris C. She is one of our top tier members and has been for a long time. We can't thank her enough, and we wouldn't still be here today if not for her help. If you would like to be as respected and revered as Chris C, then that means you will want to listen to our international TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman, as he shares with you this fun-packed bit of information. Hank? Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after, I think, 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.